can silence keep its blade hidden until the very night it chooses to strike? Can Christmas bells, meant to ring of peace, conceal the echo of judgment waiting in the dark? And can a man, strict of freedom but never of will, carve his vengeance into history with one swing of steel? Virginia, 1823, frost clung to the fields like a shroud, and houses glowed with false cheer, each candle a lie against centuries of suffering. In that hush walked Jonah, silent, patient, invisible. But silence is not absence. Silence was a ledger, heavy with debts. On Christmas Eve, when the master lay drunk by the fire, silence would lift its weapon and collect. Before we descend deeper into Jonah's haunting tale, pause with me here. These stories are not fables, they are echoes buried in the soil, waiting to be uncovered. Each one is a ledger of silence, revenge, and memory that history tried to array. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. Winter in Virginia did not arrive gently in 1823. It pressed down like a stern hand, laying its frost across the fields until every stalk of corn, every blade of brittle grass bowed beneath its touch. The air itself seemed heavy, made of iron and silence, so cold it carved into lungs and scraped against bone. The plantation stood against this winter like a stubborn monument, its windows glowing with warmth that belonged only to the master's house. From a distance it appeared proud, firelight spilling across the snow, wreaths hung above doorways, candles shimmering behind glass. But those who lived beneath its shadow knew better. The house did not glow with warmth, it glowed with hunger, its beams soaked in centuries of sorrow. For the enslaved, winter was no season of rest. Frost bit harder when rags were thin. Snow did not slow the work, it simply made footsteps heavier, breaths shorter, silence sharper. Dawn came with orders barked across the yard, and dusk fell with bodies bent over, still moving, still carrying burdens into the dark. Life was not measured in hours or days, but in tasks completed, lashes endured, humiliations swallowed. Christmas was no exception. If anything, it sharpened the cruelty. While hymns filled the parlour and tables bent beneath the weight of roasted meats, the enslaved stood in kitchens where fire burned hot but offered no comfort, where smoke stung eyes that could not look away from the endless demands of those who feasted. The sound of bells and laughter was salt pressed into open wounds. The master's house was a place of performance. Its floors creaked not only from age, but as if under strain, every board a witness to endless cruelty disguised as order. The stairs sighed as boots climbed, the shutters rattled with winter winds that seemed desperate to tear free. Even the fire in the hearth sometimes popped so loudly it startled the servants who carried trays, as though the house itself longed to cry out but was bound to silence. Jonah moved through this world like a shadow stitched to the walls. His silence was not submission, it was armour. When called, he came. When struck, he absorbed. When ordered, he obeyed. Outwardly, he was unremarkable, another figure bowed by the yoke of survival. But inside, Jonah carried something different. His silence was not emptiness, it was memory. Each slight, each wound, each lash was stored away, counted and measured. His silence was a ledger, and every cruelty became a number written in invisible ink upon his soul. On cold mornings Jonah chopped wood until his hands cracked and bled, his breath rising in clouds above the axe. Each log split felt like a whisper from the future, a reminder of what waited. At midday he hauled water, each bucket so heavy the handles cut into flesh. At night he stood behind the master's chair, pouring wine into a glass already brimming, forced to watch a man drunk on both drink and power. The master laughed with the season's joy, though his joy was always rooted in someone else's pain. His cheeks flushed red with wine, his words slurred into songs half remembered, half stolen. To his guests he was charming, to Jonah he was a tyrant whose voice echoed louder than the whip itself. The mistress watched with sharp eyes, her silence a cruelty of its own, a blade honed on indifferent. And yet, beneath this pageantry of power, despair lived in every corner. The barn groaned under the weight of chains hanging in the dark. The smokehouse smelled of salted meat, though the enslaved tasted only scraps. Children shivered in cabins where wind slipped through gaps in the wood, their lullabies nothing more than muffled sobs. The frost that etched itself on the windows at dawn seemed to sketched faces of the lost, those sold, those dead, those forgotten. Still, life persisted. Some found small rebellions in stolen moments, a whispered prayer, a song hummed so quietly it seemed part of the wind. A crumb of bread passed from hand to hand in the shadows. But Jonah did not sing, did not pray, did not weep. He counted, his silence was his song, his memory was his prayer, his patience was his rebellion. As Christmas drew near, the house grew louder. More guests arrived, boots stomping snow from their soles, voices booming through the halls. Fires burned hotter, tables groaned heavier. Music spilled from the parlour like perfume meant to mask rot. The enslaved hurried faster, carrying platters of food that never touched their lips, pouring drinks they would never taste. But amid the noise, Jonah's silence thickened. It clung to him like a second skin, unshaken by the laughter that filled the halls. To the others, Christmas was another season of cruelty. To Jonah, it was something else entirely. He watched, he waited, and in his silence the ledger trembled with weight. The frost outside grew deeper, the nights colder, the bells louder. The master's house shone like a beacon in the winter dark, but within that light a shadow sharpened. Jonah walked the halls like a ghost, unseen but always present, each step a quiet measure of the debt that would soon be paid. Jonah's silence was not the silence of peace, it was the silence of survival, born from years where sound only brought punishment. He had learned as a boy that laughter could vanish with a single sail, that words could be broken by a single lash, that even a scream might be turned into spectacle. So Jonah chose silence, not out of weakness, but because silence was the only weapon he could keep hidden. Each scar across his back was a line in a book that no one else could see. He remembered the night when his sister, Mary, was dragged away screaming, sold downriver as if she were nothing more than cattle. Jonah had been too young to stop it, too powerless to even hold her hand as the wagon rattled away. In his mind, he marked that moment in his invisible ledger. One debt, one tally of blood. His mother's cries lived there too, the day she fell in the field, her body broken by years of toil, while the overseer struck her for daring to pause. Jonah carried her final breath in his silence, another entry in the book of debts. And there were his own humiliations, countless and cutting. The time he was forced to stand in the snow barefoot while the master's children laughed, pointing at the colour of his skin against the white frost. The time he was whipped until the leather slipped flesh, only because a glass had slipped from his hand. Each wound, each humiliation was an entry. The ledger became thicker by the year, until Jonah no longer thought of himself as one man, but two. One Jonah lived on the surface, silent, obedient, bowed. This Jonah walked where he was told, worked until his body trembled, kept his eyes low, his lips closed. This Jonah gave no reason for punishment, gave no satisfaction to the master's cruelty. He was invisible, an echo moving through halls where no echo should live. But beneath that surface was another Jonah, the Jonah who counted, who weighed, who remembered. This Jonah never forgot when the master lifted his cup of wine and spilled it down his beard, laughing. Jonah remembered the hunger in the cabins. When the mistress passed him with cold eyes, Jonah remembered the warmth of his mother's hand, gone forever. When the whip cracked across another man's back, Jonah recorded it, line by line, into the ledger only silence could hold. He did not write with ink but with patience. He did not write on paper but on the walls of his mind. And in that secret book debts piled higher and higher until the weight became unbearable. At night, when others slept, Jonah stared into the dark. The cabin roof groaned with the wind, the frost drew patterns across the wood like veins in stone, and Jonah listened to the silence. To most it was emptiness. To Jonah it was a voice. Silence whispered to him that patience was not surrender. Silence reminded him that even storms begin as stillness. Silence told him that one day the ledger would be balanced. The master believed Jonah's silence was submission. He mistook stillness for defeat. He laughed at Jonah's bowed head, believing the man beneath it was broken. He never saw the eyes that counted, that measured. He never noticed the way Jonah's hands lingered a moment too long on tools, how his gaze tracked the weight of chains, the sharpness of knives, the heft of wood. Jonah lived in two worlds, the world of appearances, where he bent and bowed, and the world of silence, where he stood taller than the master himself. It was in silence that he carried his family's memory, his people's grief, his own rage turned cold as steel. The ledger was more than a record, it was prophecy. Jonah did not know when it would close, only that it must. He felt it each time the frost bit through his skin, each time the whip carved new scars, each time laughter rang from the big house while his people went hungry. Silence was no longer enough. The ledger demanded payment. He began to dream of it, not in wild flashes of anger, but in calm visions. He dreamed of balance, of judgment, of the moment when silence would not hide but strike. In these dreams Jonah was not bowed. He stood tall, axe in hand, while the house groaned and the earth itself seemed to lean closer, listening. He woke from these dreams with his heart steady, not racing. It was not madness, it was clarity. By day he endured, by night he counted. His body weakened under chains, but his silence grew stronger. He walked among his fellow enslaved, their faces hollowed by grief, their voices quieted by fear. Some prayed for freedom, some for death. Jonah did not pray, he calculated, and in his ledger the master's name sat heavier than all the others. Christmas approached, and with it the master's revelry. Jonah served wine, carried wood, swept the halls. Guests laughed, children sang carols, bells rang above the snow. Yet Jonah's silence thickened until it was no longer silence but weight pressing against his ribs. His ledger trembled with every note of the hymn, every clink of the cup. He knew now. The book could not hold forever. The debts demanded to be paid, and silence, sharp as frost, would become the hand that collected. The thought of vengeance did not come to Jonah as a flame. Flames roar and vanish, flames consume too quickly. No, his came like frost, quiet, creeping, patient, until it covered everything in sight. In the weeks before Christmas, as the plantation filled with the sound of carols and the smell of roasting meats, Jonah walked the halls with eyes sharper than any overseer's whip. Where others saw tools and trinkets, Jonah saw scripture. Where others saw choice, Jonah saw ritual. The axe by the woodpile was the first. He had swung it thousands of times, splitting logs in snow until his arms burned. Its handle was smooth, worn by years of work, the grain of the wood darkened by sweat. To the master it was a servant's tool. To Jonah it was prophecy, carved in ash and steel. He began to note how the axe balanced in his hand, how its weight shifted when lifted slowly, how easily the blade bit into frozen wood. He imagined bone instead of bark, skull instead of oak. He did not rush these thoughts, he savoured them, like a psalm whispered into the void. The house itself became part of the plan. Its groaning timbers told him where the boards creaked loudest, which steps betrayed footsteps, which corners swallowed sound. Jonah memorized them all. When he swept the hall at dusk, he pressed his ear to the floorboards, listening to the house as though it were a living beast. He learned its breathing, its secrets. If the house could be used against its master, if its silence could be turned into a veil, Jonah would know. Even the kitchen offered scripture. Knives glinted on the table, long and silver, their edges catching firelight like small suns. Jonah polished them without looking away, the cloth moving slow, deliberate, as though he polished not steel but his own resolve. Each blade was a hymn waiting to be sung. But Jonah did not choose them. Knives required closeness, and vengeance deserved something heavier, something that rang like judgment. Still he counted them in his ledger. Chains rattled in the barn, rust scraping against wood. Jonah touched them once, pretending to coil them neatly. They were thick, unbreakable, their weight enough to drag a man down. He imagined them not on his wrists, but on another's. Not as bondage, but as tombstone. He marked their presence, stored their image, though he knew they were not the weapon meant for him. He studied the rhythms of the household. The master's drinking was predictable. Wine after supper, rum before bed. By Christmas Eve he would be drunk enough to stumble, his laughter thick, his speech slurred. Jonah memorized the pattern, counting each cup poured, noting the hour when the master's eyelids grew heavy. He was not merely serving, he was measuring the moment when flesh became weak, when judgment would strike truest. Silence itself became a weapon. Jonah rehearsed his steps at night, moving across the cabin floor without sound, training his breath until it seemed to vanish. He learned to hold still for long minutes, as though he were no longer man but shadow. Silence was his ally, and he sharpened it until it became as deadly as steel. Christmas drew nearer. Guests arrived, voices booming through the halls, laughter spilling into the cold air. Jonah's silence thickened in response. The house swelled with cheer, but beneath it pulsed a current of dread only he could feel. Every carol sung by candlelight, every bell ringing across the snowy fields, became a drumbeat calling him closer to the hour. The feast was prepared. Jonah carried trays heavy with roasted meat, poured goblets until his arms ached, swept ashes from the hearth until his skin stung. He bowed when spoken to, nodded when ordered, but behind his lowered eyes he counted each detail, the master's flushed cheeks, the servants' hurried steps, the creak of the upstairs floor where the guests lay sleeping. He recorded it all. In the barn, where the axe leaned against the woodpile, he lingered longer than usual. Snow gathered on the blade's edge, melting slowly as it kissed the metal. Jonah ran his thumb over the grain of the handle, tracing the grooves left by years of labour. To others it was an object of toil. To Jonah it was judgment wrapped in wood and steel. He placed it back gently, like a priest setting down a chalice, knowing he would return when the hour demanded. The night before Christmas Eve, frost etched patterns on the cabin walls, twisting into veins that looked almost like writing. Jonah lay awake beneath the thin blankets, staring at the frozen script. He imagined it was his ledger, every vein a tally, every branching line a debt written into ice. The frost seemed to whisper back to him, urging him on. Soon, it said, soon the ledger will be balanced. Christmas Eve arrived with false cheer. Bells rang in the distance, hymns floated on the air, laughter spilled from the parlour like smoke. Jonah served and bowed, his silence steady, his body a vessel of calm. Yet inside, every moment tightened like a string pulled taut. The master grew drunk, as Jonah knew he would. He sang louder than the rest, boasting of his wealth, mocking the very people whose labour had bought his wine. He slapped Jonah on the shoulder once, laughing, spilling ale down his shirt. Jonah did not flinch. He simply bowed lower, recording the moment, knowing it was the final entry before payment was due. When the house finally began to quiet, when the guests stumbled into bed and the mistress retired, Jonah slipped outside. The snow lay heavy on the earth, reflecting the moonlight like a shroud. His breath rose in steady clouds. He walked to the barn, each step careful, rehearsed, guided by the silence he had practiced. The axe waited, leaning as it always had, ordinary to any other eye. He lifted it, feeling its weight sink into his palm, the wood biting against calloused skin. He did not rush, he did not tremble, he cradled it as one might cradle a relic. He stepped back into the house, his silence so complete the boards barely sighed beneath his feet. This was not rage, this was not madness, this was ritual. Jonah's ledger was ready to be closed. Midnight arrived like a held breath. The snow had thickened into a slow, steady fall, each flake a pale ash drifting from an unseen fire above the clouds. The yard lay blank and sermon still, the barns crouched under white caps, and the big house glowed with the last low embers of celebration. Inside, the parlour held that soft, deceptive hush that follows too much laughter. Glasses abandoned, a chair tilted a fraction off its legs, the echo of a hymn clinging to the moulding as if it, too, were unsure whether to remain. The air smelled of pine and citrus peel and the faint, medicinal sweetness of spilled liquor. Somewhere a clock ticked, brave and solitary. The house seemed to listen to itself. Jonah crossed the threshold as if entering a chapel. His breath faded into the colder dark behind him, and the axe, weight, steady, familiar, hung from his hand like a sentence that had found its judge at last. He paused just inside the door, not from fear, from reverence. He had rehearsed this stillness, this letting of the senses widen until the smallest sound spoke plainly. The floor underfoot murmured and murmurs in sleep. Far down the corridor a shutter clicked against its hook. The parlour's embers shifted, a log sighed, a single spark lifted and wandered and lost its way. Silence gathered itself around Jonah like a cloak. The master slept in the parlour, where drunk men claimed their kingdoms. He had not managed the stairs. The fire's bent light washed his face in a soft, undeserved glow. His boots, unlaced, pointed at nothing. One hand lay across his chest, open as if cradling invisible applaud. The other hung toward the floor, fingers slack, a ring catching the light and returning it with a faint, insolent glitter. His mouth rested half open, breath threading in and out in small, careless waves that touched nothing and learned nothing. His head lolled toward the hearth. Behind him, on the wall, portraits of his fathers stared down with practiced certainty, the old varnish giving their eyes an oily patience. Jonah did not look at the master first. He looked at the room. He looked at the high crown of the mantel where a sprig of holly had been wedged and forgotten, the berries dulling in the heat. He looked at the iron tongs resting beside the grate, their jaws parted like a word about to be spoken and then withdrawn. He looked at the braided rug where wax had fallen from a taper and hardened into a pale, accidental star. He looked at the shadows the tree cast against the ceiling, those long, trembling branches haloed with tin and glass. How they swayed, though the air was still. He let the room declare itself a witness. He let it be a choir of small, solemn truths. He stepped forward. The board beneath his foot answered him with the softest sigh, a tone he knew, this plank that had once betrayed him near the library and earned him a cuff for coming too sudden on a gentleman's thoughts. He adjusted a pace to the right, into the seam where the carpenter's pride had left a line of truer quiet. The axe was balanced close in, the head low, the haft canted so that his forearm and the ashwood and the intention were one lifted thing. He could feel the handle's old polish under his palm, the work of years. His work, sweat and winter, callus and sap, rubbed into a finish no purchase could own. Silence rose in him like tide, not emptiness, force without noise. In that rising, memory arranged itself not as torment, but as order. His sister's reaching hands, his mother's bent breath, a door that had shut and would not open, a laugh that had demanded he smile along with it. Each recollection took its appointed place as if a bell had rung for seating. The ledger opened. It did not rage, it showed its... Somewhere beyond the windows, bells in town were preparing their midnight duty. He felt them before they sounded, metal readying itself to be struck. He thought how strange and perfect it was that all instruments of sound await the same small moment when stillness must let them speak. He took another step. The portraits seemed to lean, the varnish deepening. One ancestor bore a sword at his hip, and the paint had captured the gleam of its hilt in a permanent dawn. Jonah held no hatred for those pigments. Paint could only do what it was made to do, fix pride to a surface and ask the future to keep looking. He kept his eyes away from the faces and let them watch as they pleased. The fire gave out a pop, a little burst like a knuckle flexing. A red coal rolled an inch and settled. The scent of pitch swelled. Jonah thought of the forest where this timber had once stood, of sap lifted like prayer through rings of slow time, of a wind that had combed a very different chorus through the branches. Everything here was borrowed: wood, heat, breath, time. He had come to return. Now the master stirred, not a waking, a small correction of a dream. His lips shaped a syllable that found no ear. He breathed again, and the breath rattled just once as if its door were narrower than it had been. Jonah felt no hurry. He had left hurry behind in the fields years ago. He let his free hand follow the haft, sliding to the place his fingers knew, the place where balance ends and leverage begins. He let his feet remember the square exactness of swinging for a clean split, the patience to wait for the wood's own seam, the refusal to snatch at a strike before it has chosen you back. There is a difference between force and judgment. He had learned it by frost and repetition. The bells began. A far tower, then another. The sound came through the panes as a trembling in the glass, a lace of tone more felt than heard, like the way a bird's shadow crosses a room and you blink without knowing why. Christmas called the hour into the air. Jonah lifted the axe, slowly, so the lift itself was a sentence and not a shout. The iron rose. The handle passed his eye, and he saw the familiar dark flecks in the wood, the small nick near the place a careless boy had once let it fall, the thin line where his thumb had worried at a splinter until the splinter surrendered. All the small history of the tool collected itself around the large purpose of the night. For a breath he held it there, in the poised country between motion and memory, where futures both happen and do not happen, where everything waits on the spine's consent. The room answered with its chorus: ember, clock, branch, shadow, far bell, winter pressing close to glass. The master's chest lifted, fell. In that suspended second, Jonah understood that what the world called revenge was only the grammar of a deeper order. He could feel the ledger's columns aligning, the way numbers stop resisting when you place them where they were always going to go. He swung. Not with rage, with accuracy. The harp traced its arc with a surety that was almost tender. The iron met its work. The sound was not loud, it was exact. The crisp report of winter wood granting a split in a clean line, the dry crack of ice surrendering to the edge it has measured and accepted without speech. The master's body jerked once, a reflex that belonged to all bodies and none. The portraits did not blink, but the fire's glow seemed to narrow, as if light itself drew in a breath at the meeting of a count and sum. What followed was quiet, a widening stillness that did not demand to be named. Jonah did not step back in triumph. He did not look to the door. He let the axe descend to his side and feel the new gravity of what it had done. He watched the man as a carpenter watches a beam after the last mallet tap, the attention not of gloating but of confirmation, the craftsperson's clean assent that the join had taken. The master's breath did not return to its careless practice. The house, which had so often seemed to side with him, shifted its loyalties beneath the simplest physics. Heat rose, smoke threaded, ash settled. Judgment was heavier than boasting, and did what heavy things do. He set the axe against the hearthstone, a careful lean as if setting down a child that had finally fallen asleep. He reached with 2 fingers and nudged a log so that it would not tumble forward and smoke the room. This was not mercy, it was tidiness. It was respect for the stage upon which silence had worked. He looked once to the ring on the slack hand, the little circle of metal that had signified permanence in a world built on taken things. It glittered again without meaning. He let it keep its cold. A draught moved through the parlour as the chimney drew. The holly above the mantel trembled, leaves, then berries. One loose berry let go and fell, bumping from carving to carving until it reached the rug and sank soundless into its threads. Somewhere in the house a guest turned on a mattress and settled. From outside the muffled report of a dog's bark carried and was lost. The bells finished their count and stood down. The last halo of tone thinned into the kind of quiet that makes even certainty feel delicate. Jonah moved through that quiet with a steadiness learned under other kinds of weight. He walked to the window and with 2 fingers lifted the edge of the curtain. Snow had written a new page over the yard. The prints he had made on his way to the barn were already softening, edges blurred to a mercy. He did not imagine erasure. Snow does not erase, it archives. He let the cloth fall. He turned back to the room that had held so many little theatres of command and reply, and he allowed himself the smallest thought that the boards and beams had, at last, heard a different script. He crossed to the threshold and paused there, as he had on entering, not to test his courage, but to honour the instrument that had served his hand. The axe's head glowed dull beside the hearth, its edge a shadow line where iron and evening met. He did not need to carry it with him. It had carried its own meaning to its end. He would not parade a tool like a banner. Judgment does not need trophies. In the hallway the air was colder. The holiday garlands looked tired, cedar fronds gone a shade too grey, ribbon losing its first bravado. A candle had burned down in a saucer and drowned itself in its last small brightness, a rim of wax like a pond in miniature. Jonah stepped past the drowned light and felt, as a man sometimes feels when crossing his own name carved by another hand, that something had finished and would not be reopened by morning. He placed his palm for a heartbeat against the wall, the lime wash cool, the lath behind it waiting, the nail heads hidden under plaster like thoughts held in a closed mouth. The house accepted the touch and gave nothing back. That was fine. He was not asking. He went the way his memory had mapped, through seams of quiet he had tested, across the tolerances of certain boards, avoiding the treacherous enthusiasm of a particular stair. The door's latch lifted without complaint. Cold reached in and took his cheeks between its fingers. The yard received him, snow brushing his ankles, night generous with its cover. The barns crouched as they had before. The cabins along the far edge of the clearing were dark except for one ember light, no wider than a thumb, drawing a frail red seam at the base of a door. He closed the door behind him without a sound, and let the night complete the sentence the room had begun. He did not run. Running wastes breath, silence keeps it. He filled his lungs once with air that bit and tested every tooth and left a clean ache in his chest. He let that ache be proof. The snow spoke in its soft way underfoot, syllables of a language without vowels. The sky carried no moon, only the kind of glow that seems to come from the snow itself, the earth lighting its own page so that a man can see where he is placed upon it. Behind him the big house held steady, its windows squares of dim winter gold, its chimneys drawing like faithful beasts, its eaves thinly lined with points that would become icicles by dawn. Within it a chair remained a fraction off its legs. A ring glittered, a berry hid in carpet, and the portraits performed their duty with their usual, tireless eyes. Before it, in the clean margin where yard gives over to field, the snow resumed its patient work, covering not denying, quieting not lying. Somewhere a fox wrote its quick cursive across the far fence line, de l'arrière. Jonah kept on until the house and then the barns slipped behind the edge of the pines. There the world changed to the world the house never sees. Needles iced into silver combs, trunks black-banded by lichen, a a small creek breathing under a thatch of white where water refused to forget its motion. He stood a moment and listened to that water keeping its vow beneath a lid of cold, and he recognized himself in it. Not the doing, the going on after the doing, the sound that does not announce itself but remains. When he moved again, it was not into escape, it was into the same earth he had always walked, the same air he had always breathed, now emptied of one noise that had believed itself permanent. The bells would ring again at dawn, men would wake and gather words and scatter them like grain. Those words would try to bind an understanding to the shape of what had happened, and the words would not be sufficient. The house would answer with its usual habits, the fire would be coaxed and fed, a broom would begin, the ledger had closed a single column, not all, never all, but one. He did not look back, the night did that for him, holding the scene exactly where it belonged, behind him finished, true. He placed his feet where the snow accepted them and did not argue. In front of him the pines joined their dark heads and made a kind of vaulted place, and the path between their trunks was a nave without walls, and the stars, hidden or present, were not required to bless him. Silence, which had lifted its weapon and spoken, resumed its older language. It walked beside him, it breathed, it kept step. By dawn, Virginia's frost lay heavy as a burial cloth. Snow muffled the fields, erasing tracks, softening edges, as if the land itself conspired to hide what had taken place within the master's parlour. The house, so loud the night before, now seemed to crouch in uneasy silence. Its windows no longer glowed with cheer. Instead, they blinked dimly against the pale light of morning, as though they, too, had seen something they could not forget. The body was found by a servant girl, tasked with sweeping embers from the hearth. She stepped into the parlour with her broom and froze. At first she thought the master had simply fallen, drunk beyond measure. But then she saw the wound, the red cleft across his head, the stillness too deep to be sleep. The broom slipped from her hands and clattered against the stone. That sound, sharp and out of place, carried through the house like a bell tolling the end of something. Guests stirred from their rooms. Doors opened, whispers tumbled down the stairs, feet hurried. The mistress entered, her face pale, her lips pressed tight as if to hold back a scream. She collapsed against the mantel, her hands trembling, her eyes refusing to leave the dark stain blooming across the rug. A neighbour was sent for, then another. Word travelled with the speed of winter wind, slipping through cracks, carried across fields by servants, by riders, by rumour. By noon the story had grown legs of its own. Some swore they heard shouting in the night, though none had. Others claimed a shadow was seen slipping into the woods, though no prints remained to prove it. A few insisted the master's enemies, debts unpaid, rivals unappeased, had finally claimed him. And yet, beneath these tales, one truth lingered unspoken, a truth too dangerous to name aloud. Jonah's silence had broken. Among the enslaved, no words were exchanged in daylight. They worked as ordered, eyes lowered, movements careful, as if the frost itself might betray them if they dared to look at one another too long. But in their silence, a spark glowed. A pot passed more slowly from hand to hand. A glance lingered, a nod held weight. In cabins that night, whispers swirled in the dark, low as breath, careful as they spoke not of fear but of awe. Jonah's name was never shouted, never sung, yet it travelled like smoke, slipping under doors, curling around sleeping children. The newspapers were less careful. By the following day, broad sheets in town carried headlines dripping with outrage. Savage act of violence, they called it. Christmas murder, the master's death, was painted as blasphemy, an affront not just to his household but to the order of Virginia itself. The words bristled with fear disguised as righteousness. Behind their ink the deeper tremor was clear. If Jonah could rise from silence, then silence itself was dangerous. Rumours multiplied with each retelling. Some said Jonah had used chains, binding his master before striking. Others whispered of poison slipped into the Christmas wine, the axe nothing more than a cover for darker arts. Still others insisted he had been seen walking calmly into the woods, the snow parting for him like water. Each story carried fragments of truth and shards of invention, but all bent toward the same gravity. He was becoming something larger. For the mistress, the house became a mausoleum. She ordered the rugs scrubbed, the hearthstones scraped, yet the stain would not fully lift. Guests stopped visiting. The portraits on the walls seemed to her no longer proud, but accusing, their painted eyes forever turned toward the place where silence had spoken. At night she swore she heard footsteps in the halls, slow and deliberate, though no one was there. Servants began to quit their posts, muttering excuses, unwilling to serve in a house where silence had broken its chains. The neighbours, too, shifted in their chairs when they spoke of it. They lowered their voices, glancing toward windows as though Jonah's shadow might be listening. Some demanded harsher laws, tighter chains, stricter patrols. Yet behind their anger was a tremor they could not admit, the knowledge that one man, armed only with patience and an axe, had shattered the illusion of control on which they built their lives. And in the cabins Jonah's act grew into legend before the week was done. Children were hushed with it, "Be still, or Jonah will come for you in the night." But in those whispers was no true fear. Instead there was pride, hidden deep, pulsing like a heartbeat. Mothers told their sons that silence could be sharper than steel. Fathers pressed hands to their daughters' shoulders and said nothing, but the silence was heavy with meaning. The frost held on for weeks. The fields lay barren, the earth sealed tight. Each morning mist rose from the river like breath from a hidden giant, curling over the land and sinking into every crevice of memory. And though no one spoke his name aloud where ears could hear, Jonah walked there, in rumour, in silence, in the unfinished ledger that had finally turned a page. The master was buried on a hill overlooking the fields, his coffin lowered into frozen soil. A preacher spoke of order, of obedience, of the wrath of God against those who rose above their station, but his words carried thinly in the cold, swept aside by a wind that moaned low through the trees. For those listening, the sermon rang hollow. For those remembering, it was a lie too fragile to last. When night fell, the cabins filled again with whispers. Some said Jonah had crossed the river, carried by a raft no one saw. Others claimed he walked north, following a star. A few believed he had simply vanished, swallowed by the snow, leaving behind only silence as proof. But all agreed on this: Jonah's story was not finished. His ledger had closed one column, but many remained open, and somewhere, whether in woods, in water, or in memory, he still walked, carrying the weight of debts yet unpaid. The house never healed. Its boards groaned louder, its shutters rattled harder, its fires burned lower, as if the structure itself understood it had witnessed something it could never cleanse. Guests stopped coming altogether. By spring the once proud parlour stood empty, the rug rolled away, the holly long withered. But even then, when the breeze pushed through the hall, it seemed to carry the faint sound of an axe splitting wood, echoing long after the act itself had ended. And so Jonah became more than a man. He became rumour, warning, and myth. His silence spread like frost, invisible yet everywhere, chilling the air long after the snow had melted, and in every whisper, in every half-truth told by firelight or carried on the wind, the story of that Christmas Eve lived on, unfinished, unresolved, like the ledger that still waited in the shadows for its final entries. Time does not bury silence, it carries it forward, carrying whispers the way frost carries breath. Years passed, and still the story of Jonah lingered, never written, never admitted, yet never gone. Children born long after 1823 grew up hearing fragments of it in the dark. Some were told it as a warning, beware the night, for Jonah still walks with his axe in hand. Others heard it as comfort. Remember, even silence can rise. Mothers whispered it to children who asked why the frost crept so heavy over the fields at Christmas. telling them the land itself remembered what had happened that night. Among the enslaved, Jonah's name moved like fire hidden under ash. Not shouted, not sung, but breathed. It became a secret prayer. Jonah, keep us. Jonah, guide us. Jonah, remind us. For them, he was no longer merely a man. He was proof that silence could be weapon, that patience could break chains, that the ledger of suffering, though long, could still be balanced. In the cabins, when the wind pressed against the walls and the hearth crackled, old ones would sit by the embers and murmur, "The ledger is never forgotten." They would tell how Jonah struck not with madness but with judgment, not with haste but with patience, not as a man alone but as silence itself made flesh. His story became lesson, warning, legend. The white neighbours, too, could not let it go. They spoke of him in hushed tones by firelight, their voices edged with fear. Some swore Jonah's ghost wandered the fields, axe in hand, eyes like embers, waiting for another Christmas Eve. Others claimed they heard his footsteps in empty halls, slow and deliberate, the boards creaking as though remembering. A few swore they saw his figure in the snow, moving between pines, only to vanish when followed. The newspapers, bound to the living world, eventually ceased to mention him. His act faded from ink. But silence does not fade as ink fades. It lingers in breath, in rumour, in the trembling of shutters when no wind blows. The house itself became part of the legend. Travellers passing years later said it groaned more than any other, its timbers forever unsettled. They claimed the parlour never warmed, no matter how fiercely a fire was stoked, as if the hearth remembered what had fallen before it. Some said the rug never truly lost its stain, that no scrubbing could erase what silence had written there. The mistress, grey and hollowed, lived on in rooms that felt like tombs, listening at night for footsteps she swore still came. She told visitors that Jonah had cursed the house, that his silence had seeped into the walls. Perhaps it had. By the time a generation had passed, Jonah's story belonged more to myth than memory. It grew with each telling. Some said he struck once, clean and final. Others swore he struck twice, the second blow ringing louder than the bells themselves. Some said he vanished into snow. Others said the river carried him away. But in every telling, the core remained unchanged. Silence became judgment, and judgment split the master's skull on Christmas Eve. Winter itself seemed to remember. Each December, when the air turned sharp and frost traced its script across the fields, people felt Jonah in the silence between bells. They felt him in the creak of a house settling under snow, in the sudden stillness of a forest when even birds seemed to hush. The land had taken his story into itself, and so Jonah was no longer bound to 1823. He was no longer bound to a house or a hearth. He lived in legend, in silence, in the unfinished ledger that still waits in every generation. His footsteps echoed not just in Virginia, but wherever silence grows heavy, wherever patience counts its debts, wherever justice hides in shadow until the hour comes. When the bells of Christmas rang, their chime was never pure again. Beneath their notes, if one listened closely, there was always another sound, an echo, low and heavy, like steel splitting wood. Some called it imagination, others called it haunting, but those who knew whispered only this: Jonah has not vanished, he waits. And in the frost that veils the fields, in the silence that sharpens the night, in the ledger that remains unfinished, his presence endures. Not history, not rumour, legend. Jonah's silence still walks,